The alarms tore through the wedding hall before the final vow was even spoken. I am Sarathiel, Queen of the Vakesh Dominion, ruler of 9 star systems and commander of fleets older than most civilizations in this part of the galaxy, and on the day I was supposed to bind myself to a human stranger, named Ethan Carter, someone tried to kill us both in front of 300 witnesses. The red light swept across the chamber walls. Guards moved instantly, forming a wall of armored bodies around the throne dais. I reached for the ceremonial blade at my hip out of pure instinct, my claws already extending, my hearing ridges flaring wide to track the source of the disturbance. This was supposed to be a political formality, a marriage of convenience between my throne and the distant, barely relevant species called humanity, arranged by council vote because Earth's growing influence in the outer trade lanes could no longer be ignored. I had expected boredom. I had expected to endure an afternoon of empty vows beside a quiet man I would barely speak to again. I had not expected gunfire. A device had been planted beneath the speaker's platform, we would later learn, placed there by a faction within my own court who believed that marrying a human was an insult to Vakesh bloodlines, a stain on 400 generations of careful breeding and political dominance. They were wrong about many things that day, but they were not wrong that something was about to change forever. They simply had no idea what. In the chaos, with smoke curling up from the dais and my guards shouting conflicting orders, I turned to look at the man I had been forced to marry, expecting to see him frozen in fear, perhaps cowering, perhaps useless, the way diplomats so often are when violence interrupts their careful words. He was not afraid. Ethan Carter stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the room with a calm, methodical sweep that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with calculation. It lasted only a heartbeat, gone so quickly I told myself afterward that I had imagined it, but in that single heartbeat, I saw something behind his ordinary brown eyes that did not belong to a diplomat. It was gone before I could name it, replaced by the same unremarkable, faintly apologetic expression he had worn throughout the entire ceremony. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, and the strangeness of those 3 words did not strike me until much later, because in the moment, I was the queen of the Vakesh Dominion, and no one told me to stay behind them. Not my generals, not my mother before she died, certainly not a human envoy I had known for 11 days. The threat was contained within minutes. My guards found the device, disarmed it, and dragged away 2 members of the Kethrali bloodline, an old noble house that had opposed the marriage from the moment it was announced. The ceremony resumed less than an hour later, because in Vakesh culture, showing fear in front of an audience is its own kind of defeat, and I would not give the Kethrali the satisfaction of believing they had won anything. I finished the vows. I bound myself, by blood and by law, to Ethan Carter of Earth. And I told myself it meant nothing. The Vakesh do not marry for affection. We marry for advantage, for bloodlines, for the careful architecture of power that has kept our dominion stable for longer than humanity has had written language. When the Council first proposed a marriage alliance with Earth's diplomatic envoy, I argued against it for 3 full council sessions. Humanity was new. Humanity was small. Their fleets were a fraction the size of ours. Their territory a single, fragile cluster of systems compared to the 9 worlds bound beneath my crown. Marrying their representative felt, to me, like binding a queen to a farmer, because the farmer's crops had grown unexpectedly large one season. But the trade routes through human space had become too valuable to ignore, and the council overruled me, as councils sometimes do even to queens, when enough voices align against a single throne. So I accepted Ethan Carter as my consort, expecting nothing from him beyond quiet cooperation and the occasional appearance at state functions. He gave me exactly that, at first. For the first several weeks of our marriage, Ethan was, by every measure I understood, unremarkable. He spoke softly. He deferred to my decisions in public without complaint. He spent long hours alone in the gardens attached to our private wing, walking slowly along the stone paths, as though counting his own footsteps. And when my advisors asked him questions about Earth's military capacity or fleet strength, he answered in vague, almost embarrassed generalities, the way a man might answer questions about a job he no longer held and did not particularly enjoy discussing. My court found him pitiful. I will admit, to my shame now, that I found him pitiful as well. He flinched when the orchestra played the opening fanfare. My advisor Vexami told me one evening, barely concealing her amusement as she reviewed the day's reports. Vexami had served my family for 3 generations and had earned the right to speak freely in my presence, a privilege she used liberally. A human, flinching at music. I begin to understand why their species took so long to leave their own solar system. He is a diplomat, I said, though even as I spoke the words, something in me hesitated. Not a soldier. We did not marry him for his bravery. We did not marry him for anything useful at all, as far as I can tell, Vexami said, setting down her data tablet. Forgive me, my queen, but the court whispers that you bound yourself to a decoration, a pet, dressed in diplomatic robes, sent here so that Earth could say they have influence at the Vakesh throne, without actually risking anyone of value. I did not correct her, because in that moment, I believed she was right. It is strange now, looking back, to remember how completely I misjudged him. The Vakesh measures strength in obvious ways. We measure it in the size of a warrior's claws, the depth of their voice, the way they hold themselves in a room full of rivals. Ethan Carter held himself like a man trying not to be noticed, and to my eyes, trained across 40 years of court politics to read dominance and submission in every gesture, that reading was unmistakable. I was wrong. I simply did not yet have the vocabulary to understand what I was looking at. There were small signs, in those early months, that I chose to ignore, because they did not fit the picture I had already painted of my human husband. There was the night a serving drone malfunctioned in the dining hall, sparking and hissing dangerously close to where I sat. Ethan moved before any of my guards did, placing himself between the sparking machine and my chair, with a speed that did not match the slow, careful way he usually walked. When the threat turned out to be nothing more than a faulty power cell, he laughed it off, calling himself jumpy, apologizing for overreacting. I noted it and dismissed it. There was the afternoon I found him in the private armory beneath our residence, a room my own ancestors had built to house ceremonial weapons going back centuries. He was standing in front of a display case containing an old Vakesh warblade, studying it with an expression I could not read, his fingers hovering just above the glass without touching it. When he noticed me, he stepped back quickly and made a small joke about wanting to learn more of our history. I accepted the explanation because it was easier than questioning it. There was the conversation overheard by one of my own intelligence officers, a fragment of a transmission Ethan made to someone on Earth, using equipment far more sophisticated than the standard diplomatic channels we had provided him. The officer reported hearing words like containment and escalation protocol, military terms that did not belong in the vocabulary of a man who claimed to have spent his career writing trade agreements. When I asked Ethan about it directly, he told me, with a calm, practiced ease, that diplomats often borrowed military language out of habit, having worked closely with Earth's defense ministries during treaty negotiations. It was a reasonable answer. I let it go, though something in the back of my mind, the same instinct that had kept me alive through 3 assassination attempts before I ever took the throne, refused to fully settle. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that a small, frightened species like humanity could not possibly be hiding anything of real consequence behind a man who flinched at orchestral music and apologized for existing in rooms full of stronger beings. The truth, when it finally arrived, would not announce itself gently. 3 months into our marriage, word reached the Dominion that the Kreth Ascendancy had begun probing our border systems again. The Kreth were old, older than my Dominion, older than most civilizations still active in this region of the galaxy, and their history was written in the bones of species who no longer existed, to argue about how they had been treated. They did not conquer in the way some empires conquer, with banners and declarations and the formal language of war. They simply arrived, took what they wanted, and erased whatever resistance stood in their way, methodically, patiently, the way a glacier erases a mountain over centuries rather than years. My Dominion had fought 2 border conflicts with the Kreth in the past century. We had survived both, but barely, and the cost in ships and lives still echoed through our military doctrine. Every general in my war council understood, without needing to say it aloud, that a 3rd conflict with the Kreth would not end the same way the first 2 had. Our fleets had grown, but so had theirs. The balance that had once favored caution on both sides was shifting, and not in our direction. I called an emergency session of the War Council the night the border reports arrived, and for the first time since our wedding, Ethan asked to attend. I almost refused him. Diplomatic consorts did not typically sit in on military planning, and I had no reason to believe my human husband would contribute anything beyond polite, uninformed questions. But something in the way he asked, quiet and direct, without the usual nervous apology in his voice, made me pause. "You may observe," I told him. "Say nothing unless I ask you to." He agreed without argument, and that should have told me something, because Ethan Carter rarely agreed to anything without first offering some small, deferential qualification. That night, he simply nodded and took a seat near the back of the chamber, and I thought nothing more of it as my generals began laying out fleet positions and threat assessments across the holographic display table. I did not yet understand that I had just allowed a sleeping storm into the room, and that it had been watching, patiently, for exactly this moment. The council session ran long into the night, generals arguing over deployment strategies, intelligence officers presenting fragmented reports about Kreth fleet movements along 3 separate border systems. I sat at the head of the table, listening, weighing options that all felt inadequate against an enemy who had crushed dozens of younger civilizations without ever needing to explain themselves to anyone. Ethan said nothing for the first 2 hours, exactly as instructed, sitting near the back of the chamber with his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. I had almost forgotten he was there at all, when General Torvask, my most senior military commander, slammed a clawed hand against the table in frustration. "We do not have the ships," Torvask said, his voice carrying the particular rasp of a Vakesh warrior trying not to show fear in front of his queen. "Not if the Kreth commit even half of what our scouts reported along the Velkara border. We held them back twice before, but twice was nearly more than this Dominion could survive." A heavy silence followed, the kind that settles over a room full of powerful beings who have just admitted, out loud, that they do not know how to win. It was Ethan who broke it. "May I ask a question?" he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried clearly across the chamber. Every head turned toward him, several of my generals visibly surprised that the Queen's decorative human consort had spoken at all. I considered refusing him again. Instead, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of some instinct I did not fully understand yet, I nodded. "Speak. Your scouts reported Kreth fleet movements along 3 border systems," Ethan said, rising from his seat and walking toward the holographic display table without waiting for permission, a small breach of protocol that drew a sharp glance from Vexami. "But you're treating all 3 as equally likely points of attack. They're not. Look at the supply routes behind each system. 2 of them would require the Kreth to extend their logistics dangerously thin. The third would not." Torvask frowned, studying the display. "You have studied our supply doctrine?" "I've studied supply doctrine in general," Ethan said simply. "It doesn't change much between species. Logistics is logistics. Whoever is planning this incursion will hit the system that lets them sustain pressure the longest, not the one that looks most threatening on a map." For a long moment, no one spoke. I watched my generals exchange glances, the kind of glances that meant they had just been handed a piece of analysis they should have produced themselves, by a man none of them had taken seriously until that exact second. I watched Ethan Carter step back from the table, fold his hands again, and quietly return to his seat, as though he had not just rearranged the entire strategic picture in our war room with a single observation. I did not say anything to him that night. I simply watched him more carefully than I had before, and for the first time since our wedding, I found myself wondering exactly who I had married, and whether the man standing quietly at the back of every room I entered was really the man I thought he was. I did not yet know how wrong I had been. I did not yet know how much further that wrongness would stretch before the truth finally caught up to me, in fire and silence, along a border system whose name I would never forget. But that night, walking back to our private quarters in silence beside him, I found myself studying his hands, his posture, the careful way he moved through doorways as though clearing them out of old habit, and for the first time, the question that had been quietly building in the back of my mind finally took shape. What exactly had I married? The weeks that followed the council session changed something between Ethan and me, though I could not yet say what. He did not suddenly become a different man overnight. He still walked the garden path slowly, still deferred to me in public, still wore that same faintly apologetic expression whenever my court spoke around him, as though he were furniture. But I no longer believed the expression was the whole truth of him. I had seen, however briefly, the calm precision behind his eyes when he rearranged my entire War Council's strategic thinking in under a minute, and I could not unsee it. I began watching him the way a queen watches a rival, not out of fear exactly, but out of the same careful attention I gave to anyone whose true intentions I had not yet measured. I noticed things I had missed before, or perhaps things I had seen, and simply refused to acknowledge. The way his eyes moved to every exit point the moment he entered a room, cataloging them before he ever took a seat. The way he ate with his back never fully turned to a door. The way he slept, when I happened to wake in the dim hours before dawn, and glanced toward him, lightly, his breathing even, but his body angled in a way that suggested readiness rather than rest. I asked Vexami to quietly gather what information she could on his service record with Earth's diplomatic corps. She returned 3 days later with a file so thin it was almost insulting, a handful of routine postings, a few unremarkable trade negotiations. Nothing that explained the man I was beginning to suspect lived beneath the surface of the one I had married. "It is either the record of a profoundly unremarkable career," Vexami said, setting the file down on my desk, with the particular caution of someone who already suspected the truth was more complicated, "or it is the record of a man whose actual history has been very carefully removed." I did not answer her, because I did not yet know which possibility frightened me more. The Kreth border incursions did not stop after that first council session. If anything, the reports grew worse with each passing week. Scout vessels along the Velkara system, the one Ethan had identified as the most logistically sound point of attack, began reporting Kreth patrol activity in numbers that suggested something larger building behind the scenes. My generals doubled their own patrols. I authorized additional fleet movements to reinforce the border, though I knew, the way every Vakesh military officer knew, that reinforcement alone might not be enough if the Kreth committed to a full assault. It was during this tense period that the Council decided I should personally travel to the Velkara system, both to inspect our defenses and to meet with representatives from 3 smaller allied worlds whose support we would need if conflict came. It was, by any measure, a routine diplomatic and military inspection, the kind of trip queens of the Vakesh Dominion had made 100 times before without incident. Ethan was scheduled to accompany me, as protocol required for a consort during official state travel. I remember, the night before we departed, watching him pack a single travel case with the same careful, economical movements he brought to everything, folding each item with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, and I remember thinking, with a strange flicker of unease I could not fully explain, that I was glad he would be with me. I did not yet understand how much that decision would matter. We departed the capital aboard the royal transport, the Sovereign's Wake, escorted by a modest fleet of 6 warships, more than sufficient protection for what was, on paper, an unremarkable diplomatic journey. I spent much of the voyage in briefings with my military staff, reviewing border reports and allied fleet capacities, while Ethan occupied himself quietly in the ship's observation lounge, reading through data files on a portable terminal, exchanging the occasional polite word with crew members who still did not quite know what to make of him. It was on the 3rd day of our voyage, as the Sovereign's Wake approached the outer edge of the Velkara system, that the alarms began again. This time, they did not stop. The first warning came from our lead scout vessel, a transmission cut short halfway through its message, the words, "multiple contacts bearing," dissolving into static before the line went dead entirely. My fleet commander, a steady officer named Draskon, ordered immediate defensive formation, and within minutes, the Sovereign's Wake and its 6 escort warships found themselves staring down a Kreth raiding force nearly 3 times their size, emerging from concealment along the system's outer asteroid field, with the kind of coordinated precision that told me, immediately, this was no accident and no probing patrol. This was a trap, and we had walked directly into it. I will not pretend I was calm in those first chaotic minutes. I have commanded fleets in simulation, studied tactics across decades of preparation for a throne I always knew I would inherit, but nothing prepares a person for the reality of enemy warships closing distance on a vessel they are standing inside of, weapons charging, the ship's hull groaning under the first exchange of fire as our escort ships moved to intercept incoming threats. Draskon's voice crackled across the ship's internal channel, sharp with controlled urgency. "Your Majesty, we need to get you to the escape pods. The Sovereign's Wake cannot hold this position against a force this size. I refused, at first, because Vakesh queens do not flee while their people fight, a principle drilled into me since childhood that felt, in that moment, both noble and suicidal in equal measure. It was Ethan who finally moved me from that position, appearing in the command corridor with an expression I had never seen on him before, calm in a way that had nothing to do with fear or its absence, calm in the way of someone who had simply done this before, many times, in circumstances far worse than this one. "Sarah," he said, using my name without title for the first time since our wedding. A breach of protocol so small it should not have mattered, and yet somehow cut through my panic more effectively than any formal address could have. "Listen to me. Your fleet commander is right. You being on this bridge does not make your people safer. It makes them divide their attention protecting you, instead of fighting the enemy in front of them. Let them do their job. Let me do mine." "Yours," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, fear and confusion bleeding into anger the way it so often does. "What exactly is your job, Ethan? You have spent 3 months telling this court you negotiate trade agreements." Something shifted in his face then, something old and tired, and far heavier than the polite diplomat's mask he had worn since the day we met. "I'll explain everything," he said. "I promise you that, but not here, and not now. Right now, I need you to trust me, even though I know I have given you very little reason to." The ship shuddered violently as another Kreth volley struck our shields, and somewhere down the corridor, an alarm began warning about hull breaches on the lower decks. I made the decision that would change everything that followed, the decision that, looking back, I believe was the first true act of trust I ever extended to my human husband. I nodded, and I let him lead me toward the escape pods, even as every instinct in me screamed that a queen does not run. What happened next I did not witness directly, though I have since pieced it together from the accounts of the crew who survived that day, accounts that still, even now, leave me with a strange tightness in my chest each time I hear them retold. Rather than entering the escape pod meant to carry him away from danger alongside me, Ethan diverted at the last moment toward the Sovereign's Wake's auxiliary command station, a secondary control room rarely used except during emergency situations, precisely like the one unfolding around us. Draskon, monitoring the chaos from the main bridge, would later tell me that a voice came through the auxiliary station, calm and clipped, requesting access to the ship's defensive systems with an authorization code that should not have existed for a diplomatic consort, a code that, when verified, granted clearance levels Draskon had never seen attached to a civilian designation in his entire career. I was already sealed inside the escape pod by then, the small craft beginning its launch sequence, when I watched through the narrow viewport as the Sovereign's Wake's defensive pattern shifted entirely. Our remaining escort ships, which had been fighting a desperate, losing formation against the Kreth raiders, suddenly began moving with a coordination I did not recognize, executing maneuvers that seemed to come from somewhere outside our own military doctrine entirely, picking apart the Kreth formation with a precision that felt almost surgical. I did not understand, in that moment, what I was witnessing. I only knew that the chaotic, losing fight I had been staring down moments earlier had become something else entirely, something with order and intention behind it, and somewhere in the center of that sudden shift was my husband, the quiet man who flinched at orchestral music, sitting at a console he should never have known how to operate. The escape pod carried me, along with 2 attendants and a small security detail, away from the Sovereign's Wake, and toward a rendezvous point my fleet had established kilometers away, and for nearly 20 minutes, I had no way of knowing whether the ship I had just been forced to abandon would survive at all. When the Sovereign's Wake finally limped into the rendezvous point, scarred and venting atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches but unmistakably, miraculously intact, I felt something in my chest loosen that I had not even realized was clenched. 3 of our 6 escort warships had been lost. The Kreth raiding force, by contrast, had been reduced to scattered, retreating fragments, their formation broken so thoroughly that what remained of their fleet fled the system entirely, rather than press an advantage that no longer existed. It should have been a defeat. By every reasonable measure of the forces involved, it should have been a catastrophic, humiliating defeat for the Vakesh Dominion. Instead, we had survived, and the enemy had fled, and the official reports that followed in the days afterward struggled to explain exactly how that had happened. citing unusually effective coordination among our surviving escort ships, without ever quite identifying the source of that coordination. I knew the source. I had seen him walk into that auxiliary command station with a calm I had never witnessed from him before, and I had heard, secondhand, the description of his voice giving orders that no diplomat should have known how to give. When I finally saw Ethan again, hours later, aboard the recovering Sovereign's wake, he looked exhausted in a way I had not seen from him before, his usually composed expression replaced by something rawer, something closer to the truth. "You promised me an explanation," I said, standing in the doorway of the small medical bay where he sat being treated for a minor injury sustained during the chaos. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw no apology in his eyes at all. "I did," he said quietly, "and I intend to keep that promise. But you should know, before I do, that what I'm about to tell you will change how you see me, possibly how you see your own Dominion's place in this galaxy. I need you to be ready for that." I sat down across from him, my hands steady despite the storm building inside me, and I told him the only thing I could tell him in that moment, the only thing that felt true. "I have been ready since the moment I watched you walk toward danger instead of away from it. Tell me everything." And so, for the first time since our wedding, my husband finally began to speak the truth. We sat together in that small medical bay for nearly 2 hours, the recovering hum of the Sovereign's wake's damaged systems filling the silences between his words, and by the time Ethan finished speaking, I understood that everything I had believed about humanity, about my husband, and about my own Dominion's place in this galaxy, had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. "My service record says I was a trade negotiator," he began, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who had clearly rehearsed this confession many times in his mind, without ever expecting to actually give it. "That part is true, technically. I did negotiate trade agreements, for a while, near the end of my career. But before that, for almost 11 years, I served as a fleet commander in Earth's defense forces. Specifically, I commanded a vessel during what my government still refers to, in classified files, only as the Threshold conflict." "I have never heard of this conflict," I said, and even as I spoke the words, a cold unease settled into my stomach, because in my centuries of studying galactic history, in all my briefings on Earth's military and political development, I had never once encountered any reference to a war by that name. "You wouldn't have," Ethan said. "It happened almost entirely outside the awareness of the wider galactic community, in a region of space far beyond Earth's officially recognized borders, decades before humanity made formal contact with species like yours. We kept it quiet, deliberately, because what we learned during those years convinced our government that revealing the full extent of our capabilities to the rest of the galaxy would create more problems than it solved." "What happened?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed somewhere past me, somewhere I could not follow. "A Kreth scouting fleet found Earth," he said finally, "long before any of you knew our species existed. They did what the Kreth always do. They assessed us as small, primitive, unworthy of negotiation, and they began what they intended to be a methodical occupation. The same pattern your historians have documented in dozens of other systems over the centuries. They expected it to take a few years, based on their usual timeline for absorbing young civilizations. And it did not," I said quietly, already beginning to understand the shape of what he was telling me. "It took them 11 years to realize their mistake," Ethan said, "and by the time they tried to withdraw, it was already too late for the fleet they had committed. Humanity does not fight the way your historical opponents fought the Kreth, Sarah. We do not believe in proportional response. We do not believe in measured retaliation that leaves an enemy capable of trying again later. When something threatens what we consider essential to our survival, we do not stop until that threat no longer exists in any meaningful capacity. The Kreth learned that lesson at a cost that, to this day, our own historians struggle to fully calculate, because we have never released the complete numbers, not even within our own government records." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced since the alarms first tore through my wedding hall months earlier. "You were part of this," I said. It was not a question. "I commanded one of the response fleets during the final 2 years of the conflict," Ethan said. "I was young, by human standards, barely qualified for the rank I held, but the conflict had stretched our resources thin enough that experience mattered less than results. I won't describe the details to you, Sarah. Not because I don't trust you, but because some things are better left undescribed, even to someone I care about. I will tell you that by the time the Kreth fleet operating in our territory finally withdrew what remained of their forces, what remained was very little. And Earth told no one, I said. Not the wider galactic community. Not any of the species you have since made contact with. We made a deliberate choice, Ethan said. Our leadership at the time understood something that I don't think your Dominion has fully grasped yet, about how power works in this galaxy. A species known to be capable of what we did to that Kreth fleet becomes a target for every paranoid empire that fears being next, and a tool for every desperate civilization looking for a weapon to point at their own enemies. We chose silence instead. We chose to present ourselves to the wider galaxy as exactly what you believed us to be when this marriage was first proposed. Small, new, unremarkable. It has kept us safer than any fleet ever could. I sat with that information for a long time before I finally spoke again, turning over the implications the way I might turn over a foreign coin, trying to understand its true weight. And you, I said, why would Earth send a man with your history to marry a foreign queen? Why not send an actual diplomat, someone with no military past, to complicate the optics of the arrangement? Ethan's expression shifted again, something almost wry crossing his exhausted features. Because my government does not entirely trust the Vakesh Dominion's intentions either, Sarah. Forgive me for saying that so plainly, but you asked for the truth. Earth wanted someone in this marriage who could recognize a genuine threat if one emerged, and who would know exactly how to respond if your court ever decided that an alliance with humanity had outlived its usefulness. I was meant to be a quiet insurance policy. I was never meant to reveal myself unless something forced my hand. And today, I said, something forced your hand. Today, he agreed, something forced my hand. I did not know, in that moment, exactly what I felt. Anger, certainly, at having been deceived for months by a man I had shared a bed and a throne with. Fear, at the scale of what he had just described. The casual, almost clinical way he spoke about a war, so devastating that an entire species had chosen permanent silence, rather than risk drawing attention to what they had survived. And beneath both of those feelings, something else entirely, something I did not have a clean word for in my own language, a strange, reluctant awe at the man sitting across from me, who had walked toward a Kreth raiding fleet with the same calm he might have shown walking into a garden. Why tell me now? I asked, instead of letting your secret remain buried, the way Earth clearly intended. Ethan looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because the Kreth who attacked us today were not testing your border defenses, Sarah. They were testing mine. Someone within their command structure has begun to suspect that humanity's presence in this marriage is not what it appears to be. And if that suspicion spreads, the next attack will not be a probing raid with a raiding fleet 3 times our escort's size. It will be an effort to eliminate what they perceive as an emerging threat, before that threat has time to fully reveal itself. You deserve to know the truth before that happens, not after. A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the medical bay. You believe they will come again, I said. I believe, Ethan said quietly, that what happened today was only the opening move. He was right, though neither of us could have predicted exactly how quickly the rest of the board would reveal itself. In the weeks that followed our return to the capital, intelligence reports from across the Velkera border grew increasingly troubling. Kreth fleet movements that had once been sporadic and exploratory became deliberate, coordinated, the kind of buildup that any experienced military analyst would recognize as preparation for something far larger than another probing raid. My war council convened almost daily, poring over fragmented reports, trying to piece together the Kreth ascendancy's true intentions before it was too late to respond effectively. Ethan attended every session now, no longer sitting quietly at the back of the room, but standing alongside General Torvask and Draskon, contributing analysis that consistently proved sharper and more accurate than anything my own military staff produced independently. The transformation in how my court viewed him was immediate and, in some cases, almost uncomfortable to witness. Officers who had openly mocked him months earlier now deferred to his judgment without hesitation. Vexami, who had once called him a decoration sent by Earth to humiliate my throne, began addressing him with a careful, formal respect she extended to very few people in my entire court. I found myself, during those long council sessions, watching him less as a queen evaluating a useful asset, and more as a wife trying to understand a husband she had never truly known, until violence forced him to reveal himself. There was a strange grief tangled up in that process, a mourning for the quiet, harmless man I had spent months believing him to be, even though that man had never actually existed at all. One evening, after a particularly grim briefing detailing fresh Kreth fleet sightings along 3 separate border systems simultaneously, I found Ethan alone on the balcony outside our private quarters, staring out at the lights of the capital city below. "You have been quiet tonight," I said, joining him at the railing. "I keep thinking about what's coming," he admitted, not looking at me. "I've seen this pattern before, Sarah. Multiple coordinated incursions, escalating slowly enough to look like routine border tension, fast enough to actually be preparation for something bigger. The Kreth did something similar in the early years of the Threshold conflict, before they understood what they were dealing with. And if this becomes the same kind of conflict," I said carefully, "will you do what you did then? Will you reveal what Earth has spent decades hiding?" He turned to look at me then, and in the dim evening light, I saw something in his expression that I recognized now. Something I had completely misread the first time I encountered it during our wedding, mistaking calculation for fear, mistaking restraint for weakness. "I will do whatever it takes to protect you," he said simply, "and your people, whether that means staying quiet or revealing everything Earth has spent decades trying to keep buried. I made a choice the day I married you, Sarah, even if neither of us understood at the time what that choice would eventually demand of me." "What choice?" I asked. "To consider your Dominion mine to defend," he said, "not because Earth ordered me to. Because somewhere in these last few months, despite everything, despite the way this marriage began, you stopped being a political arrangement to me. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it happened." I did not have a response ready for that confession, not one that felt adequate to the weight of it, and so I simply stood beside him at the railing, the two of us watching the Capitol's lights flicker against the darkness, both of us aware, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever calm remained between us was almost certainly borrowed time. 3 days later, the Kreth Ascendancy launched their full assault on the Velkara system, and the quiet, careful man I had married disappeared entirely, replaced by something the Kreth Ascendancy had never expected to find waiting for them at the edge of a dominion they believed they understood. I would spend the rest of my life grateful that I was there to witness what happened next, even though, in the moment itself, I was certain it would be the last thing I ever witnessed at all. The first reports of the Kreth assault reached the capital in the dead hours before dawn, and within minutes, the entire palace had transformed into a storm of urgent movement, messengers running between command centers, my generals pulling on armor they had hoped never to need again, the steady, practiced calm of a dominion, preparing for the worst kind of war it knew. I was already dressed and standing in the war room by the time General Torvask delivered the full scope of the attack. The Kreth Ascendancy had committed not a raiding force, but what our intelligence officers estimated to be their entire regional fleet, striking simultaneously across all 3 of our border systems in a coordinated assault clearly designed to overwhelm our defenses before reinforcements from the capital could arrive. Velkara, the system where Ethan and I had nearly been killed months earlier, bore the heaviest concentration of enemy ships, a force so large that Draskon's voice, normally steady even in crisis, audibly shook as he relayed the numbers across our command channel. "They mean to break us in a single engagement," Torvask said, his claws pressed white against the edge of the holographic display table. "If Velkara falls, the systems behind it have no defensible position. The road to the capital itself would be open within days." I looked around the war room, at officers who had spent their entire careers training for exactly this kind of conflict, and still found themselves staring at numbers that made victory feel like a distant, almost impossible hope. And then I looked at Ethan, standing quietly near the back of the chamber, exactly as he had during that very first council session months earlier, though everything about how I saw him now had changed completely. "What do we do?" I asked him directly, in front of my entire war council, a question that would have been unthinkable to ask a human consort only a season earlier. Ethan stepped forward, and for the first time in our marriage, I watched him speak not as a careful, deferential diplomat, but as the commander he had once been, his voice carrying an authority that filled the room without needing to be raised. "You commit everything you have to Velkara," he said, studying the deployment map with sharp, focused attention. "Every reserve fleet, every defensible position, every ship that can reach that system within the next 12 hours. You hold the line there, even if it costs you ships you cannot easily replace. Because if Velkara falls, nothing behind it will matter." "That is exactly what the Kreth want us to do," Torvask said sharply. "Commit our reserves to a single overwhelming engagement, and lose everything in one battle." "I know," Ethan said calmly, "which is why I am also requesting permission, Your Majesty, to send a transmission of my own." The room fell silent. I understood, immediately, what he was asking, though I do not think anyone else present fully grasped the weight of what was about to happen. "You mean to call for human assistance," I said quietly. "I mean to call for the only assistance that can guarantee Velkara holds," Ethan said. "I am asking you to let me reveal what Earth has spent decades hiding from this galaxy, Sarah. I am asking you to trust me with the survival of your entire dominion, in exchange for a truth I cannot take back once it is spoken." I had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would alter the course of galactic politics for generations, and I made it without hesitation, because somewhere over the previous months, without fully realizing it, I had already decided to trust this man with everything that mattered to me. "Send it," I said. "Whatever it is, send it now." The transmission Ethan sent that night, I would learn much later, traveled through channels my own intelligence officers did not even know existed. Encrypted layers built into communication arrays my technicians had assumed were standard diplomatic equipment, reaching across distances that should have made any response impossible within the time frame we desperately needed. I did not know, in those tense hours that followed, whether anyone on the other end of that transmission would even answer in time. I only knew that Velkara's defenders, badly outnumbered, had begun their desperate stand against a Kreth fleet that showed no hesitation, no mercy, and no intention of allowing this engagement to end any way, except in the Dominion's total defeat. Reports trickled in throughout the night, each one worse than the last. 2 of our defensive stations along Velkara's outer perimeter had already fallen silent. Draskon's forces, reinforced by everything the capital could spare, were holding a defensive line that grew thinner with every passing hour. The Kreth fleet, grinding forward with the patient, merciless persistence that had crushed dozens of civilizations before mine. I stood in the war room through the entire night, watching the situation deteriorate on the holographic display, my hands clenched so tightly that my own claws drew blood from my palms without my noticing. Ethan stood beside me, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on a section of the display that, as far as I could tell, showed nothing but empty space at the edge of the system. "How long?" I finally asked him, somewhere near the 7th hour of the engagement, my voice hoarse from hours of receiving grim updates. "How long until your transmission means anything at all?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted quietly. "It depends on what was already deployed nearby, and how fast my government decides to respond. I won't lie to you, Sarah, there's a real chance this comes too late." I do not know how to fully describe the despair that settled over me in that moment, watching the woman I had become, the queen who had spent her entire life believing her own strength was sufficient to protect her people, finally confronting the limits of that strength in real time, watching my dominion's fate hinge entirely on the response of a species I had, only months earlier, dismissed as small and irrelevant. And then, in the 8th hour, the display changed. A single contact appeared at the very edge of Velkara's system, registering on our sensors with a signature unlike anything our technicians had ever recorded before. At first, the operators monitoring the display assumed it was sensor error, a glitch in the system caused by the chaos of battle. But the contact held steady, growing slightly clearer with each passing second, until finally, the sensor operator's voice cracked across the command channel, with something between confusion and disbelief. "Your Majesty," she said, "we are reading a single vessel entering the system. Unknown configuration. The size readings are, I need confirmation, because the numbers we are receiving do not seem possible." "Confirm them," I said, my eyes fixed on the display, on the single small point of light that had just appeared at the edge of a battlefield that had, until that exact moment, felt entirely hopeless. The vessel's mass signature suggests a single ship larger than our entire combined fleet currently engaged at Velkara, the operator said, her voice barely steady. I have triple-checked the readings, Your Majesty. They are consistent. I looked at Ethan. He was watching the display with an expression I had never seen on him before. Something that was not quite relief, not quite pride, but a kind of grim, focused readiness, as though he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment to arrive. That's the Halcyon, he said quietly. She was the closest deployed vessel within range of my transmission. I served under her current commander once, years ago, back when neither of us held the ranks we hold now. One ship, Torvask said, disbelief evident in his voice. You are telling me one human vessel is meant to turn the tide of a battle our entire reserve fleet has been unable to hold? Ethan turned to look at him, and the calm certainty in his voice silenced every doubt in the room, more effectively than any argument could have. Watch, he said simply, and you will understand exactly what Earth has spent decades trying not to show this galaxy. What followed, even now, defies easy description, though I have replayed the recorded footage of that engagement more times than I can count in the time since, trying to fully understand what I witnessed that night. The Halcyon did not approach the Kreth fleet cautiously, did not attempt the careful, measured engagement tactics that had governed every Vakesh military doctrine for centuries. It moved directly into the heart of the Kreth formation, with a speed that seemed to defy the vessel's apparent size, weapon systems activating in a pattern our sensor operators struggled to even categorize, energy signatures unlike anything our own technology produced. The Kreth fleet, which had spent the previous 8 hours grinding methodically through our defensive lines with patient, overwhelming force, found itself facing something it had clearly never encountered before, something that did not follow the rules of engagement it had spent centuries refining against younger, weaker civilizations. Where the Kreth fought with calculated, sustainable aggression, designed to minimize their own losses while methodically overwhelming an opponent, the Halcyon fought with a different philosophy entirely, one Ethan had described to me weeks earlier, without my fully understanding what those words actually meant in practice. Disproportionate response, total, immediate, overwhelming retaliation, delivered with a speed and intensity that left no room for the enemy to adapt or regroup. Within 20 minutes, the Kreth fleet's coordinated assault had collapsed entirely into disorganized retreat, ships breaking formation in what our sensor operators described as something approaching panic, an emotional state none of us had ever associated with the Kreth ascendancy in the entire recorded history of our conflicts with them. Within 40 minutes, the engagement was effectively over. What remained of the Kreth fleet fled the Velkara system entirely, abandoning damaged vessels rather than risk further engagement with a single ship that had, by every metric our technology could measure, just dismantled an assault force 3 times my Dominion's combined fleet strength in less time than it had taken me to drink a single cup of evening tea. I stood in the war room, surrounded by officers who had spent their entire careers believing they understood the true scale of power in this galaxy, and watched every one of them stare at the display in a silence that bordered on disbelief. I felt that same disbelief settle into my own chest, though mixed with something else entirely, something that had been building quietly within me for months without my fully recognizing it, something I finally allowed myself to name as I turned to look at the man standing beside me. Ethan Carter, the quiet diplomat my court had once mocked as a decorative pet, the man who flinched at orchestral music during our wedding, who walked the garden paths slowly as though counting his own footsteps, who had spent months allowing my entire Dominion to underestimate him completely. He did not look triumphant. He did not look satisfied, the way I might have expected from someone who had just demonstrated his species' capacity for overwhelming, devastating force in front of an audience that had spent months doubting his very competence. Instead, he looked tired, almost burdened, watching the aftermath of the engagement with an expression that suggested he understood, far better than anyone else in that room, exactly what kind of power had just been unleashed, and exactly what it had cost his own species to develop it. It's done, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. For now. I reached out and took his hand, the gesture small and almost instinctive, the first time I had done so in front of my entire war council, without the careful, calculated formality our marriage had always demanded. You saved my Dominion tonight, I said. He turned to look at me, And for the first time since I had known him, I saw the full weight of everything he had been carrying since the day Earth first sent him to marry a foreign queen he had never met. The careful, exhausting performance of unremarkable competence. The loneliness of a man who had spent his entire career learning to hide what he was truly capable of. "I saved my wife's people," he said quietly. "That was never a difficult decision, Sarah. I just wish I hadn't needed to wait this long to show you why." The days that followed the Battle of Velcara unfolded with a strange, disorienting quality, as though the entire Dominion had been holding its breath for months without realizing it, and had only now finally allowed itself to exhale. Reports flooded in from across our border systems confirming what the sensor readings at Velcara had already suggested. The Kreth Ascendancy, an empire that had menaced the galaxy's younger civilizations for longer than anyone could accurately calculate, had withdrawn entirely from our region of space, recalling fleets from systems they had occupied for generations, retreating with a speed and totality that our own intelligence officers struggled to explain through any framework except one. Fear. The Kreth Ascendancy, for the first time in living memory, had encountered something it genuinely feared, and rather than risk further confrontation with whatever force humanity truly represented, they had chosen to disappear back into the depths of their own territory, leaving the systems they once threatened to rebuild in relative peace. My court, which had spent months treating my human husband as a curiosity at best, and an embarrassment at worst, transformed almost overnight into something approaching reverence. Officers who had once mocked his quiet manner now lowered their eyes slightly when he entered a room. Veximi, who had called him a decorative pet sent by Earth to humiliate my throne, requested a private audience with him within days of the battle. An audience I later learned consisted almost entirely of her offering a formal, careful apology, the kind of apology Vakesh nobility rarely extends to anyone outside their own bloodlines. I watched all of this unfold with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and discomfort, because while I understood the fear and awe driving my court's sudden shift in behavior, I also recognized, with growing clarity, that they had simply traded one form of misjudgment for another. They had dismissed Ethan as weak because he did not display strength in the obvious, performative ways our culture had taught us to recognize. Now they revered him for the same reason they had once mocked him, not because they understood him any better, but because they had finally witnessed proof of a power they could not ignore. I did not want to make that same mistake twice. I found him, on the evening after the formal victory ceremony concluded, sitting alone in the garden where he had spent so many quiet hours during the early months of our marriage, walking the same stone paths he had walked when I still believed him to be exactly what he appeared to be. The Velcara campaign, and the days of formal recognition that followed it, had clearly taken something out of him, a tiredness that no amount of rest seemed fully able to address. "The court has decided you are the most fascinating man in the galaxy," I said, sitting beside him on the garden bench, after spending months believing you were the least interesting. A faint, tired smile crossed his face. It's a strange feeling, being seen for the first time after months of choosing not to be seen at all. I'm not sure I know how to exist in a room where people actually pay attention to what I say. "You will learn," I said, though I find myself wondering whether that is truly what you want, to be seen the way they see you now, as a weapon, wearing a diplomat's clothing. He turned to look at me then, something thoughtful in his expression. "What do you see, Sarah, when you look at me now?" I considered the question carefully, because it deserved careful consideration, and because I owed him an honest answer after everything he had given my dominion, at the cost of his own carefully guarded privacy. "I see a man who spent months allowing an entire court, including his own wife, to underestimate him completely," I said, not because he enjoyed the deception, but because he understood something about power that my own culture has never fully grasped. We measure strength by how loudly it announces itself. You measured your own strength by how quietly you could carry it, until the moment it was truly needed. "That's a generous reading," Ethan said. "It is an honest one," I said. "I judged you the day we married, Ethan. I judged you by every standard my culture has ever used to measure worth, and I found you lacking, because you did not perform strength the way Vakish nobility performs it. I was wrong, and I do not think the lesson I learned from that mistake is simply that you are powerful. I think the lesson is that I never once asked you what you had survived, what you had sacrificed, what it had cost you to become someone capable of doing what you did at Velcara. I treated your quiet as emptiness, instead of recognizing it as the weight of something you were carrying alone. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching the evening light fade across the garden paths, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability I had never heard from him before, not even in the medical bay aboard the Sovereign's wake, not even during the darkest hours of the Velkara engagement. I spent 11 years of my life learning exactly how much damage I could do to protect the people I cared about, he said quietly. And then I spent the years after that learning how to live quietly with that knowledge, because the alternative was letting it define every relationship I ever tried to build afterward. When Earth assigned me to marry you, I expected another posting where I would need to hide that part of myself completely, another arrangement built on careful distance rather than honesty. I did not expect to find someone I actually wanted to be honest with. And now, I said, you no longer have to hide it. No, he agreed, but I find myself wondering whether you can still see me as your husband, now that you have also seen me as a weapon. Those are not always the same thing in the eyes of the people who love someone like me, Sarah. Sometimes the power becomes all anyone sees afterward. I reached for his hand, the same instinctive gesture I had made in the war room days earlier. Except now there was no audience, no political necessity behind the action, only the quiet, private truth of two people who had finally stopped hiding from each other. I see both, I said. I see the man who flinched at orchestral music during our wedding, because he understood that performing fear was sometimes safer than revealing strength too early. I see the commander who walked toward danger instead of away from it, not because he wanted to prove something to my court, but because protecting the people he cared about mattered more to him than his own safety. I do not need you to choose between those two versions of yourself, Ethan. I have come to understand, slowly and at great cost, that they were always the same man. In the months that followed, the political landscape of the galaxy shifted in ways that none of the great powers had fully anticipated. Word of the Battle of Velkara spread quickly, despite Earth's best efforts to manage the narrative, and humanity found itself, almost overnight, regarded with a caution and respect that no amount of diplomatic posturing could have achieved on its own. Other empires, who had spent decades treating Earth's representatives as minor curiosities at best, suddenly found themselves recalculating every assumption they had made about humanity's place in galactic affairs. My own dominion benefited enormously from the alliance my marriage had created, though I came to understand, in the quiet conversations Ethan and I shared in the months that followed, that the true value of what we had built together was never really about military advantage at all. It was about the strange, unlikely partnership two very different people had managed to forge, despite a beginning built entirely on political convenience and mutual misjudgment. I think often, even now, about the woman I was on the day of our wedding, the queen who looked at her human consort with barely concealed contempt, who measured his worth entirely by the standards of a culture that had never once considered the possibility that true strength might choose silence over spectacle. I think about how close I came to spending my entire reign beside a man I never truly understood, simply because I never thought to ask the right questions, never thought to look past the quiet exterior he had so carefully constructed. The Kreth ascendancy has not returned to our border systems since that night, though my generals remain cautious, understanding, as Ethan has taught all of us to understand, that true peace is rarely permanent in a galaxy as vast and complicated as ours. But I no longer face that uncertainty with the same fear I once carried alone as queen, because I have learned, in the most dramatic way possible, that the man beside my throne is not merely a political arrangement, not merely a useful asset secured through a marriage of convenience. He is the one presence in this entire galaxy I never have to face alone, the quiet strength standing beside me, through every threat my dominion has yet to encounter, and every threat still waiting somewhere in the depths of space we have not yet charted. When my advisors ask me now, as they sometimes still do, whether I regret the marriage that was once forced upon me by political necessity, I tell them the truth. The same truth I learned slowly across months of misjudgment, danger, and finally, understanding. I tell them that the day I married Ethan Carter, I believed I was accepting an unworthy consort, a quiet, unremarkable man whose presence beside my throne would always feel like a diminishment of everything I represented as queen. I was wrong about almost everything that day, except for one thing. I was, indeed, accepting something far greater than I understood. I simply had no idea, standing beside him during those empty wedding vows, exactly how much greater that something would eventually prove to be, or how completely it would change the way I understood strength, power, and the quiet, patient love of a man who had spent his entire life learning exactly when to hide his power, and exactly when to finally let it be seen.